Welcome back to Movies Are So Back, the YouTube movie review channel where I, Ethan Simmie, ask the question, are movies so back? Another week, another episode of Severance. This week it is episode 6 titled Attila, and how the hell does this show keep getting better? I don't get it. Last week's episode was all about power and how within certain and specific relationships, power was exhibited ruthfully and without remorse, and how power drove those relationships. This week's episode all about love and how specific relationships thrive on love, and more importantly, who deserves certain types of love. I think this week's episode is the most thematically impressive episode of Severance that we have gotten yet, and I am just thoroughly impressed by this week's episode. I didn't think that we were going to get this deep, this intense, and manage to move the plot forward in a way that we did, and it kind of is the whole package of an episode. It did everything, dare I say, perfectly. I'm not really going to break this episode down scene by scene or talk about anything in specific or particular, because I think there's honestly just too much to talk about. But what I find the most intriguing and the most fascinating, and the thing that I grappled onto the most for this specific episode, was this dynamic of relationships. And I think specifically the fact that there are so many competing and juxtaposing relationships that are now entering this like new era and this new stage of fruition within the Severance world, that I am just kind of in awe over every single time that I watch them. And all of these relationships were exhibited, and this idea of love within these relationships were exhibited in varying degrees, which I found really well done. First relationship of note is Dylan and Gretchen. Obviously, we get the scene where Dylan's innie is talking to Gretchen, and then we get this scene later in the episode where Dylan's outie is talking to Gretchen at home, and notably Gretchen mentions that the visit was canceled and she did not in fact visit Dylan's innie. This relationship to me is the saddest of all relationships, and I know we have Bert and Irving, and that relationship, especially in this episode, gets ultimately quite sad and heartbreaking. But this relationship between Dylan and Gretchen, and the idea of just staring at somebody and like talking about your life and just wanting to hug them, Gretchen wants that out of Dylan, like her outie Dylan, like her real husband, and doesn't get that. And I think their dynamic is really fascinating because it is, I think, the most like fundamentally juxtaposed in terms of like the innie relationship versus the outie relationship. Who deserves what type of love? And it really opens up the question of, who do you love? Do you love this idea of a person? Do you love what they might be, what they could be? Or do you love the actual person that is appearing in front of your eyes? I think Dylan and Gretchen's relationship really harkens to that question. Now, most notably, this episode, of course, Mark and Helly and their relationship as innies grows. They bang, which is fantastic. This is great. I love that Severance is going in this direction. We get a very awkward scene with Helena and Mark at the Chinese restaurant as well, and their relationship and how power dynamics play in that relationship. But I think the most important thing about Mark and Helly's relationship exhibited in this episode is how meaningful certain types of love is to certain people. And again, it just asks the question, who are you in love with? Who are you having sex with? Who are you sharing these moments with? Because Helly makes it a point to say, look, that wasn't really me, and I'm sorry about that. Let's try to reconcile that. Guess what? It's not really Mark either. So we are at a all-time moral quandary here, because Mark is undergoing this process of reintegration, and he is not 100% himself either, yet he is portraying that to a now 100% innie Helly, and it's getting pretty gray. It's getting like a real gray zone here about the moral and ethical boundaries and kind of stamina of what is allowed. So I found that intriguing. I briefly mentioned the relationship with Bert and Irving. This time we are introduced to Fields. This is Bert's husband. The guy just like needs to take a chill pill. Bert signed up to be an innie, and it doesn't sound like Irving is Bert's first physical relationship within the Severance program, which, again, interesting little nugget here. But my guy Fields has got to lay off the wine, because things got a little awkward and a little testy and a little heated, and I think there's more here. I just don't think that we're quite done with what Bert's background is alluding to. It looked a little suspicious at the end. The last little bit that I wanted to say on this relationship theme and love theme for this episode is Devin coming over to Mark's house. Now, this is kind of a throwaway moment, very quick, done in humor, done in jest, but Devin comes over to Mark's place and is basically like, hey, do you remember that lady that was at the birthing center, the lady that I kind of had a crush on? She might not have actually had a crush on her. She might have just thought she was pretty. She could have also just actually, for real, had a crush on her. So that is really interesting and exciting. And it also just opens wide the relationship between Devin and Rickon and what that is to those specific individuals. It might not seem like it's a very important line, but to me, I really caught onto that. And I was like, whoa, there's a lot more going on with ideas of who we love, who we allow ourselves to love, and why we might not always accept who we want to love. Winners and losers of this week's episode. Last week, the winner was Lumen, again, exhibiting that monstrous power over Mr. Milchick specifically, but over pretty much all of its Lumen employees. This week, it's love. It's love, guys. It's love. Mark and Helly had sex. Irving went over to Bert's house, shared some wine, and Gretchen and Dylan are, I don't know if they're withering away or if they're growing, but it's love. The loser of this week's episode. Last week, it was Mr. Milchick. He had a pretty poor performance review, did not do very well with that. This week, it's Mr. Milchick again. My guy is going down an absolute depressive rabbit hole, putting paper clips on papers nonstop, just really feeling the trauma of that, physically, bodily shaking because he is doing that. And this idea of deduction of critical thinking, which I think is something really cool that this show does, especially in this moment with Mr. Milchick having to basically take what he tells Miss Wong and deduce until he is yelling at himself to just grow. He's lost again. I'm so sorry. And I hope that he comes back. I hope he's stronger than ever next episode, but this is tough. Predictions for next episode. If you've been joining along on a weekly basis here on the channel, I usually don't have any like concrete predictions. I'm just really bad at it, and that's something that I've accepted in my life. I will ask the question though, with the way that this episode ends, with Mark and his test essentially to speed up the reintegration process, and then he hits his head on the floor. Are we going like full reversion? Like, are we going back to a space and a place where Mark has lost all progress and might not remember anything? I'm a little bit worried that we might be entering kind of that reduction period in the progression that we've made with Mark. Is TV so back? Absolutely. Prestige TV continues. We are on a real all-time run here. Between last week's episode and this week's episode, it was announced that Severance has now become the all-time most watched television show on Apple TV Plus, surpassing Ted Lasso. Thank God, because this show is actually good. Pew, 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 pew. I will say, shout out to this episode. The blocking, the lighting, the framing continue to absolutely stun. Every single episode, they are using every single inch of the frame, and it is a beautiful thing to see in action every single week. What did you think of this week's episode of Severance? Drop a comment below and let me know what you thought of it. Let me know what your thoughts are on the season as a whole so far, and maybe your predictions for next week as well. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to this channel, and hit the bell so you don't ever miss when I upload a new review of Severance or any other movie or TV show. You can also follow me on Letterboxd for any of my movie reviews and thoughts over there, and I'll see you in the next video.